They let them die while doctors watched and called it research. The year is 1932. Dust drifts across the red clay of Macon County, Alabama. The sun glares over the fields where sharecroppers, black men, poor and hope-starved, labor under a sky heavy with injustice. A knock at the door, government doctors offering free medical exams, hot lunches, transportation. A promise, relief from bad blood. But they did not promise cure. They offered observation, not treatment. These men, nearly 600 in number, 399 already with syphilis, 201 free of it, were lured into what they believed was care. Instead, they entered a breach of trust. For decades, they were told lies. No informed consent. No clarity. Their fate sealed in bureaucratic memos and moral blindness. Doctors refused penicillin. Even after it became the accepted cure in the 1940s, these men were denied treatment. You can hear the faint drip of a faucet in a lonely clinic, smell the antiseptic that never heals, feel the tremor of fear when a man realizes that the medicine is only sugar, that the exams are lies. Some go blind, others go insane. Long nights, silent suffering, betrayal by those trusted. As decades pass, reports multiply. Autopsies, heart disease, tertiary syphilis ravages organs, wives contract the disease, children born with congenital syphilis, families torn apart, legacy of shame and death. How could a nation devoted to progress allow such cruelty? They promised care, delivered betrayal. Even now, in debates over medical consent and vaccine trials, Tuskegee's shadow looms large. Distrust, seeded by this history, contributes to hesitancy in minority communities. But one secret was still waiting. Among the stethoscopes they whispered, "He's next." The small clinic in Tuskegee smelled of bleach and stale sweat. A nurse's gloved fingers slid a tongue depressor into a patient's mouth. The man swallowed, heart pounding. He thought he was here for free treatment. But beneath the routine exams and murmured reassurances lay a darker agenda. In 1936, the Public Health Service published results of a study they claimed was scientific. But few read beyond the headline, "Untreated syphilis in Negro males." No one saw the real hidden footnote. The men were not treated. The written reports made public, yet the truth stayed buried. Investigators in peer-reviewed journals praised the study's rigor. But within the margins, data spoke of staggering death rates, organ failings, and neurological collapse. Local doctors were pressured to refuse treatment. The Public Health Service convinced, and sometimes coerced, county physicians not to intervene. Even as penicillin became available in the 1940s, locals were told to stand down. Here, the psychological weight sets in. These men, many illiterate or unfamiliar with medical jargon, trusted the white coat. They were told the study was their care. The voice of authority superseded their body's alarms. One man's chest rattled with pneumonia, another's gait faltered from neurosyphilis, but no one explained why treatment was withheld. Each year investigators returned. Spinal taps, lumbar punctures, blood draws. The jab of needles, the taste of iron in their mouths, the cold echo in the lab halls. Many suspected nothing. Some felt suspicion coil like smoke in their minds. Tension escalated internally and externally. In the 1950s, civil rights movements surged. Across Alabama, black communities agitated for dignity and equal health. Yet the Tuskegee experiment persisted silently, poison beneath legitimacy. The climax of this section. By the 1960s, rumors reach ears in Washington. A young epidemiologist named Peter Buxton begins asking questions. He fears a moral collapse. He writes internal memos ignored. The program continues. Emotional peak. Imagine being a man in that study, breathing harder than ever, seeing a neighbor die and realizing they are watching me die. The betrayal becomes intimate. If doctors could have saved them, why choose silence? They treated him as data. The echoes of Tuskegee reverberate in modern scandals, from unethical clinical trials to pharma companies hiding side effects. Distrust is inherited. But one secret was still waiting. A brown envelope would condemn decades of silence. In San Francisco, 1966, Peter Buxton sits in a fluorescent-lit cubicle at the U.S. Public Health Service. He reviews piles of STD case files when a colleague offhandedly mentions Tuskegee. His heart hammers. Curiosity becomes dread. What he pieces together sends a chill through him. He writes a letter to William Brown, head of the Venereal Disease Division. Have any of the men been told the study's true nature? Are untreated syphilitics still being followed for autopsy? His first formal protest. His plea lands in a drawer. Bureaucrats shrug. The study will continue. Buxton's envelope contains roundup reports, official logs of how subjects were collected, coerced, tracked through towns and farms. The dry type pages contradict the sanitized public story. Men transported under guise of health exams, promised meals or burial coverage. He confronts his superiors. They call his concerns trash, unnecessary, disloyal. A meeting is called in Atlanta. In a wood-paneled room, he faces stern officials led by John Cutler, an assistant surgeon general entwined with Tuskegee's leadership. They warn him to stay silent. One official tells Buxton he's ruining the experiment by asking questions, as though research were sacred and human life incidental. Back in his apartment, Buxton handles the envelope's pages in trembling fingers. He can taste the stale dust from the envelope flap, hear his pulse in the silence. The weight of that paper is heavier than steel. He knows that leaking this is dangerous. His career, his reputation, his life may be at stake. The internal conflict claws at him. Duty to science or duty to humanity. Every day he works for a system that protects the experiment over its victims. He dreams in uneasy sleep about men he never met dying slowly, unheard. Then a spark. He recruits a journalist friend in Washington, D.C. He whispers fragments, shows the documents. In July 1972, Gene Heller of the Associated Press breaks the story. Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. The bomb detonates across front pages. High voltage, the disclosure forces Senate hearings. Congress demands answers. The study is finally terminated. Lives already lost become public tragedies. Did revealing the truth destroy more than it saved? Brown envelope, truth's slow volcano. This envelope, this moment, mirrors countless whistleblowers in our time, from government leaks to hidden pharma trials. History repeats when institutions protect power over people. But one secret was still waiting. When the press printed it, America couldn't breathe. On July 25, 1972, the sky over Washington, D.C. seemed to crack. The Associated Press ran the story. Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years. Newspapers everywhere carried it. The shock reverberated in small towns and big cities alike. In Macon County, men waited for ambulances that never came. Families sat stunned in their homes, listening to radios broadcasting accusations, denials, outrage. The hush of decades shattered into sirens, congressional investigations, angry voices in the streets. The betrayal was now public. Inside the halls of power, senators demanded answers. Edward Kennedy led a Senate subcommittee hearing, cornering Public Health Service officials under searing cross-examination. How long were they aware of penicillin's effectiveness? Why did they withhold it? Officials sputtered. They defended continuity of science, masked cruelty in jargon. The cameras caught their sweat. The nation watched. In one hearing room, a widow wept as she recounted her husband's decline. Blindness, convulsions, a body riddled with syphilis's wrath. No doctor ever said it was preventable. No voice had told her that help had been withheld. The world heard her sobs. The government eventually admitted wrongdoing, but not to criminal charges. Despite the calamity, no one went to jail. The experiment's architects escaped criminal prosecution. The public was left with apologies and compensation. The settlement was modest and conditional. Many victims were already dead. In 1974, a class action suit ended in a 9-10 million settlement, allocated among survivors, their heirs, and even control group participants. But by then, horrors were irreversible. You can almost hear the crackle of microphones, smell the stale perfume of committee rooms, feel the ripple of disbelief on every face. The betrayal became national shame. Medical ethics were exposed naked. Could apology ever repair what was stolen? Life, dignity, trust. They paid in silence and death. The ripple from Tuskegee echoes today in clinical trials, scandals, pharmaceutical cover-ups, and debates over informed consent in marginalized communities. But one secret was still waiting. They broke us, and medicine swore, never again. The morning after the Senate hearings, the air felt different. The weight of decades of silence hung, but cracks had formed. In halls of power, the government convened an ad hoc advisory panel to examine the mess. In Macon County, families listened to crackling radios, hearing rumors that their agony might at last force change. Inside that panel's report, the truth was laid bare. There was absolutely no evidence that informed consent was ever sought. The experiment had persisted long after penicillin became the standard cure. The men had been watched, not healed. The panel condemned the study as ethically never justified. Yet no criminal charges would follow. Political power shielded the architects. The reforms born from this scandal were structural. They target future experiments, not past victims. The cold machinery of institutional safeguards would arise, not direct justice for those who died. Congress passed the National Research Act of 1974, establishing the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. This commission drafted the Belmont Report, anchoring three ethical pillars: respect for persons, beneficence, justice. These guidelines would force institutional review boards, IRBs, and oversight to be standard in research. The phrase "never again" became a mantra in medical ethics. But those reforms, while sweeping, felt hollow to survivors. Many had already passed. Compensation came in 1974 in a $10 million settlement, small, delayed, conditional. But more damage lingered. Families had lost fathers, brothers, the trust in medicine itself. The compensation was a drop in the ocean compared to lives and dignity lost. You can hear the shuffle of legal pages, smell the process paper in hearing rooms, feel the collective exhaustion of those who demanded accountability. The emotional hyphen. Medicine rebuked its own. The disease of institutional racism had been exposed in operating rooms, not just in clinics. Could new rules ever heal the wounds they built? Ethics born from betrayal's ashes. These protections, IRBs, ethical review, consent laws, are now standard in clinical trials globally. Yet data scandals, pharma misconduct, and AI bias show the same questions persist. Who watches the watchers? The skeleton of Tuskegee's betrayal still looms over every controversial medical trial. But one secret was still waiting. They broke more than bodies, they broke trust forever. After the official end in 1972, the silence did not heal. In the villages and towns around Macon County, a dark hush settled over every clinic, every doctor's visit, every whispered cough. Black men carried a memory sharpened by betrayal, every stethoscope, every white coat, now a question. Stanford researchers would later show that when the Tuskegee scandal became public, life expectancy for black men fell further. They withdrew from health systems, delayed care, fled medical offices. Medical mistrust became generational trauma, a wound carried forward in every sickle cell clinic, every HIV test booth. The U.S. government and health agencies tried to respond. President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology in 1997, calling the study shameful and racist, totally unethical. At Tuskegee University, a bioethics center and legacy museum were founded to preserve memory, educate future generations, and never forget. But apologies and museums cannot staunch the fear that medicine will betray you. In subsequent decades, researchers found that proximity to Tuskegee correlated with lower rates of medical utilization, fewer preventive screenings, and higher mortality. The scandal's wound was not local in other counties. Decades later, fewer black men even show up to screenings. On a hot Alabama afternoon, a granddaughter watches her grandfather refuse to enter a free clinic. He whispers, "Those doctors took his life once, how can I trust them now?" She feels the weight in the air, the smell of antiseptic, the distant buzz of hospital machinery, but he doesn't move. The memory is too visceral. The emotional peak here is collective. A community clinically betrayed, families slamming shut doors on public health, fear implanted like a silent poison. The fracture is deep. Can a system ever earn trust after choosing to watch people die? Trust died in examination rooms. In COVID-19 vaccine debates, the Tuskegee name is evoked again and again. Among communities that feel past evil experiments haunt current ones. Even today, health disparities, trial recruitment inefficiencies, and institutional skepticism trace a lineage back to that betrayal. But one secret was still waiting. They sued, they survived, but who would speak for the dead? After the national uproar, lawsuits rolled in. In 1973, surviving men and their families filed Pollard v. United States. Attorney Fred Gray, already famed for civil rights law, took the case and pressed for reckoning. As the case dragged on, survivors awaited justice in limbo. The government finally offered a $10 million settlement, lifetime medical benefits, burial stipends, and payments to heirs. But for many, relief came too late. Those already dead were gone, their families left with broken trusts and empty arms. Issues over how to use leftover funds, whether for memorials, community health, or museum upkeep, became another legal battleground. In Macon County, descendants gathered in quiet circles. They shared oral stories of fathers who spoke little, left little, died early. The stigma of the experiment hung like a coat too heavy to discard. At annual gatherings, candlelight flickers over faces, names read aloud, voices trembling. The act is part memorial, part therapy, part protest. The men may be gone, but the silence they endured remains alive. Through this, one figure emerges. Bill Carter Jenkins, a PHS statistician turned crusader. In 1968, he attempted to halt the experiment from within, writing memos, warning superiors, pushing for intervention. Later, he became one of the officials overseeing benefits to survivors. He is both insider and outsider, someone who knew the machinery and tried to bend it. His moral tension becomes a portrait of conscience in crisis. The emotional high point here lands in the survivors' homes. An old man clutching a letter, a daughter pressing two faded photographs, a granddaughter asking, "Grandpa, why did they lie?" The grief is generational, the betrayal inherited. If justice came decades later, who truly owns the story, courts or families? They sued for dignity, got silenced too. Today, debates over reparations, institutional apologies, and unclaimed settlement funds echo this fight. The same questions arise in compensation for environmental harm, police abuses, corporate wrongdoing. But one secret was still waiting. Their silence became a poison in trust's veins. The hallways of clinics across black neighborhoods grow colder. A skin rash appears. Someone hesitates before calling the doctor. The cough lingers too long. People remember Tuskegee, the drills, the broken promises, the disease left untreated. The mistrust, once whispered, now pulses in every medical exam, every laboratory room, every syringe. After 1972, scholars began measuring what was invisible, how deep this betrayal had burrowed. Stanford researchers found that the public revelation of Tuskegee correlated with lower life expectancy among black men and with decreased use of doctors and hospitals. Men living closer to Macon County experienced sharper declines in health utilization. In stark numbers, mortality rose. Fear, the residue of decades of deception, became a health hazard. But the connection is more than statistical. In focus groups across U.S. cities, African Americans voiced their suspicion. How do I know they won't experiment on me? They treated my grandfather like he was a lab rat. This mistrust stems from history, reinforced by current inequities and discriminatory treatment in hospitals. Knowledge of Tuskegee only partly explains present mistrust. Some people have never heard the details, yet still feel the weight of medical betrayal. Mistrust is not just historical, it's living. Every misdiagnosis, every ignored symptom, every unequal treatment reopens the wound. In real rooms in hospitals, the tension is tangible. A patient sits, elbow trembling as a stethoscope presses against their chest. They question the doctor's motives. The antiseptic smells antiseptic, sterile, but the mind smells danger. They feel a pressured skirt of doubt. Will they lie like they did to my people? The climax here, medical trust becomes a battleground. Communities demand transparency, representation, accountability. Clinics host listening sessions. Researchers working in black communities begin to talk openly about Tuskegee, from silence to confession, from avoidance to reconciliation. Can a health system ever regain trust once it was built on betrayal? Trust fractured, healing must begin. The legacy of Tuskegee shadows vaccine hesitancy, clinical trials in minority populations, debates over data privacy in health tech. Even in 2024, mistrust derived from it fuels resistance to public health campaigns. But one secret was still waiting. They say medicine advanced, but the ghosts still trial us. Decades after Tuskegee, new experiments emerge in clinics, labs, and hospitals. A researcher recruiting participants in a vaccine trial hears a thorn in black communities, whispers of Tuskegee redux. A patient asks, "How do I know I won't be left untreated?" The wounds are reopened by modern trials, reinforcing the fear that science can betray again. In the 1990s and 2000s, studies showed that knowledge of Tuskegee correlated with reduced trust in researchers. One survey found that among African Americans aware of the Tuskegee study, 51% reported less trust in researchers, compared to 17% of whites. Pew Research in 2022 showed 75% of black adults say they've heard about Tuskegee, and a majority believe that research misconduct is still possible today. Some modern public health efforts, HIV programs, vaccine drives, are hindered not by logistics but by the specter of Tuskegee. In communities where health workers arrive with free pills or trials, resistance spikes. One field hospital in a black neighborhood hit by an outbreak installs open-air tents for trial participants. The antiseptic stings the nose, machines hum. A mother holds her sick child and scans faces of staff in crisp lab coats. She thinks, did they heal or experiment on my father? The line between treatment and trial blurs in her mind. The climax here. Researchers now whisper about Tuskegee effect in IRB meetings, how to balance enrollment in minority communities without reviving trauma. Bioethics courses cite the study. Consent forms are rewritten in plain language. Institutions invest in transparency protocols and community liaisons. The field changes, but mistrust fights each innovation. When past betrayal frames every trial, can any consent truly be free? When healing smells like history's betrayal. From COVID-19 vaccine rollout hesitancy to debates on gene editing trials, Tuskegee's stain is invoked again and again. In many marginalized communities, the question is no longer should I trust medicine, but can I survive it? But one secret was still waiting. Tuskegee didn't end. It mutated in plain sight. The streets of Macon County sleep under a humid moon. Cicadas hum, a dog barks in the distance. Behind closed doors, descendants flip through old medical charts, scanning scribbles in pencil. Names crossed out, dates misaligned, notes in margin about autopsy scheduling. The air smells of old paper and mildew, an archive of betrayal. Meanwhile in Washington, policy staffers whisper about health equity pipelines, community oversight, data trust frameworks. But beneath the technocratic language lies an unspoken tension. Can systems built by the betrayed ever become trustworthy? Their doubt is audible in the click of keys, the whispered Tuskegee in meetings. We return to 1974's class action settlement. The government promised medical care, burial benefits, and cash. Yet many recipients still complain of administrative barriers, delays, and denials when claiming benefits. Some claims were rejected over technicalities. Some payments never arrived. A few government memos, recently declassified, admit fear of liability contagion if settlement is generous. The mindset still lingers. Treatment is expense, reputational risk greater than human cost. In hospitals today, black patients sometimes hesitate at consent forms. They ask, "What are you really doing with my blood?" In one academic medical center in 2021, recruitment for a genetic study slowed when patients raised Tuskegee as cautionary tale. The tension spirals. Do we treat with promise or watch with protocol? The climax in this section arrives with a document leak. A 1990s Internal Health Agency memo recommends heightened oversight for trials in marginalized groups to preempt Tuskegee comparisons. The memo implies guilt deep enough to shape policy. It confirms the specter is alive in bureaucracies. Emotion peaks when a young black researcher, grandson of a participant, holds that memo in trembling hands. He sees his grandfather's name in sponsorship logs. He smells the antiseptic scent of his own lab. He wonders, was that study the only betrayal or just the first? When institutions hide in reform language, who is watching the watchers? They change the name, not the crime. In data privacy scandals, algorithmic bias, and unethical gene editing trials, the Tuskegee archetype haunts every ethical breach in medicine and tech. Health data taken without full disclosure, experimental drugs tested on underprivileged populations. These are echoes of the original crime. But one secret was still waiting. Buried memos whispered, guilt that wouldn't stay buried. In Washington's dusty archives, file cabinets recoil under decades of ink and erasure. Somewhere inside a dark room, a staffer slides a folder across a metal table. The lamplight glints off the edges. The paper crackles. It's a declassified memo from the 1950s, bearing the initials of John Cutler and Bill Jenkins, directing local physicians not to treat certain inactive syphilis patients so as not to disturb the study's continuity. The note is clinical, cold, detached, but its implications thunder. Beneath the illusion of observational science, deliberate human suffering was being managed. That same file holds a margin note in pencil. Must avoid liability, must restrict external intervention. The fear is clear in handwriting. Even then, they foresaw exposure. The system's own conscience, or its bureaucracy, left these scraps in margins as a confession disguised as procedure. These memos confirm systemic coordination between federal, state, and local doctors to suppress treatment access in the study area. One memo hints at plans to delay announcing penicillin efficacy so that the experiment's dataset stays intact. When the archival box opens, you feel the weight, scent of old paper mingled with stale air, the sudden drop in temperature, the hush over your own breathing. The revelation forks tension. If they plan to silence cure, how many other programs did the same in less notorious places? This is a historical turning point. Up until now, we've felt the tragedy. Now we see the design. The experiment was not just passive observation, it was engineered neglect. At this moment, the emotional peak crashes. Descendants who have gathered in a local meeting hear the echoes. A granddaughter reads aloud from the memo. Do not disturb natural course. She chokes on the phrase. The room flares into bitter outrage and grief. This memo is a key to the locked door of conscience. If cure was suppressed by design, how deep did the conspiracy run? Neglect by design, not omission. This kind of internal memo control echoes today in pharmaceutical companies hiding side effect data, tech firms suppressing algorithmic harm, or governments delaying environmental cleanup, structures where concealment is built into policy, not just error. But one secret was still waiting. They passed new laws, but ghosts lurked in the shadows. From the rubble of public outrage, laws rose. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act, birthing a federal mandate. All human subject studies must get voluntary informed consent and must be overseen by institutional review boards, IRBs. The National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects was formed to draft guiding principles. In 1979, the Belmont Report codified three core ethical principles: Respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Federal rules tightened. Any study funded by health agencies must comply. The era of unmonitored experiments was supposed to end. But change is never pure. The reform process stumbled. In new IRB meetings, ethics discussions masked power plays. Some researchers viewed the new rules as burdens, impediments to real science. Others lobbied for exemptions when their study population was vulnerable but convenient. Some research proposals still slip through weak oversight, under vague phrasing, small sample sizes, or minimal risk claims. At a university committee room in the 1980s, a principal investigator rolls in a study involving minority communities. He presents anonymized benefits, downplays risks. An IRB reviewer raises a question. Can you guarantee participants understand? Or are we just assuming? The room still echoes with Tuskegee's silence. The emotional peak arrives when a former subject's grandson attends a presentation on research ethics. He hears those familiar terms risk-benefit ratio, consent form. He scans the audience. Most are white, most are unknown faces. The air feels cold, antiseptic. His heart clenches. Is this reform or repetition in new clothes? When new rules echo old language, are the past's wounds ever truly healed? New law, old ghosts linger. Even today, IRB systems are critiqued for lack of teeth, bureaucratic loopholes, and boards too friendly to researchers. Recent controversies over data privacy, AI trials, and biotech consent show the same structural tensions persist. But one secret was still waiting. You inherited more than your name. You inherited fear. In a dim living room in rural Alabama, an elderly woman unlocks a dusty box of photographs. One shows her grandfather in rough work clothes. Behind him, a medical tent looms. She traces his worn face with her finger. She cannot see the disease that consumed him, but she can feel the legacy in her bones. The air smells of old wood and must. A child shivers. History lives in that room. The psychological wound of Tuskegee did not stop at death. It seeped into families, whispered in bedtime stories, woven into silence around doctors and hospitals. Medical distrust became inherited. Some researchers call this historical trauma, the trauma experienced by one generation transmitted to the next, shaping perceptions, fears, and behavior. African Americans who learned of the Tuskegee study showed more skepticism of medical researchers. A 1998 survey found that 51% of Black respondents said knowledge of the study reduced their willingness to trust scientists, compared with 17% among whites. Stanford's research tied the public disclosure of Tuskegee to 1.4 fewer years of life expectancy for Black men in some places, attributing part of the survival gap to avoidance of health care. Every clinic visit can echo the betrayal. A doctor's hesitation, a lab test delayed, a past denial of agency. The mistrust is not myth, it's behavior, rooted in memory and experience. Trauma is not just remembered, it is biologically encoded. Some studies suggest that intergenerational trauma can impact stress responses and health behavior, influencing how bodies and minds react to medical systems. In some Black communities today, stories of Tuskegee are taught as family lore, not as history alone, but as cautionary gospel. In inner cities, in rural towns, in waiting rooms across America, you see the tension. A patient clenches the edge of a chair, hesitates before signing a consent form. Their doctor asks, "Do you have questions?" The patient replies, "I have history." Behind the sterile walls, they carry an emotional burden older than penicillin. The emotional hypon. A young woman, granddaughter of a Tuskegee participant, trains as a nurse. She enters a hospital smelling of antiseptic and fear, wearing scrubs, something she once distrusted. In the mirror, she sees both healer and inheritor. She steadies her heart. Will I heal or betray? Can someone born after the experiment still carry its wounds in their veins? Medical fear passed mother to child. In vaccine hesitancy, in genetic research, in AI health predictions, Black communities sometimes respond with hesitation not because of ignorance, but because of ancestral memory. The same mistrust built in Tuskegee operates today in consent forms, underrepresented trials, and data misuse fears. But one secret was still waiting. Some complicit hands were Black too, a betrayal within betrayal. The oak trees on Tuskegee's campus whisper of complicity. At Tuskegee Institute, leadership and staff sometimes acted as intermediaries or enablers. The betrayal was not unidirectional. The very institutions of Black uplift became tangled in a moral web. Robert Russa Motten, president of Tuskegee Institute when the study began, lent institutional legitimacy. He agreed to let public health service teams use campus space and recruitment assistance. His name appears in correspondence endorsing cooperation. Dr. Eugene H. Dibble, Jr., a Black physician affiliated with the Institute, also played a controversial role. He was asked by the government to serve as liaison. Some records suggest he encouraged recruitment under promises of free health care. These local actors believed, some sincerely, some under pressure, that they were helping their communities gain access to care they wouldn't otherwise receive. But the ends were corrupted by silence. When penicillin became available, many local physicians were pressured or incentivized to deny treatment to those enrolled. The line between voluntary cooperation and coercion was blurred. Many community leaders feared seeming uncooperative with federal agents or losing access to scarce resources. Some local physicians feared ostracism or loss of funding if they opposed the public health service's commands. That tension ripples in small towns. A county health officer is pressured by Washington to keep quiet. He fears both political consequences and local backlash. He weighs loyalty to medical ethics against survival in a white supremacist, resource-scarce system. You can smell the stifled cigarettes in office backrooms, hear the soft footsteps of men packing, watch gloved hands shuffle files that can't see daylight. Local complicity makes the betrayal more bitter. It is community betrayed by its own. The emotional peak arrives when a descendant confronts the Institute's archives, a ledger listing study allowances next to names of Black faculty who cooperated. The ledger feels like a ledger of moral debt. Her voice cracks. You sold your brothers for funding. When locals help the betrayal, who carries the deeper wound? They wore Black faces in white lies. This phenomenon isn't unique to Tuskegee. In many modern scandals, leaders within marginalized groups may be co-opted, turning into gatekeepers or collaborators under duress. The same dynamic surfaces in corrupt development projects or insider capture of NGOs. A ledger entry betrayed what they claimed they forgot. In the dim light of an archival room, a researcher flips through a thick funding ledger from the Public Health Service circa 1950. The pages are yellowed, the ink smudged. Under the heading Syphilis Research Allocations, one line reads simply, Tuskegee Observation Continuing. Next to it, marginal notes. Hold back cure funds. delay supply orders. At first glance, it could be dismissed as clerical or budgetary ambiguity, but the context is chilling. This is money meant for medical programs, yet withheld. Behind the sterile veneer of study funding lies a darker choreography, resource denial as part of the experiment. That ledger suggests strategic financial obstruction, not accidental oversight. Some entries even cross-reference local clinics in Macon County being underfunded purposefully during penicillin rollout years. Suddenly, the ledger becomes a smoking gun. It pulls into focus a deeper question. If funds were allocated but never dispersed, was the withholding of care part of the design? If so, the betrayal was baked into budgets, not just medical decisions. The tension ratchets when you recall that, decades later, descendants apply for health benefits under the Health Benefits Program and are denied on clerical grounds. Claim forms missing, eligibility disallowed, funds declared exhausted. The ledger's omission echoes in their refusal. Visceral detail. You can almost smell the musty ledger, hear pages creak under fingertips, feel the electric charge in the room as that line is read aloud. The ledger's silence screams of complicity. When a descendant activist digitizes the ledger and overlays it with treatment supply logs, a pattern emerges. In years when penicillin shipments arrived, the Tuskegee Observation Fund spike. In years when supplies should have reached Macon County, the line item funding dips. The ledger begins to map a timeline of denial. If they controlled the purse strings, how many lives were denied even before the needle was drawn? Budget lies hide medical betrayal. Today, we see similar patterns in healthcare deserts, where budgets are allocated but withheld, and communities are chronically under-resourced. In pandemics and clinical trials alike, funding lines can be the real battleground. But one secret was still waiting. They wrote what they never said aloud. In a cluttered medical office at Tuskegee, tucked behind stacks of journals and prescription pads, lie the private notebooks of study physicians. The paper is thin, yellowed, pages filled with cramped, precise handwriting. Each entry documents patients, symptoms, treatments, or the lack thereof. The air smells faintly of antiseptic and dust, a mixture of sterility and decay. Some entries reveal frank admission that penicillin was withheld intentionally. One physician even notes, men unaware, data intact, deaths unavoidable. These lines are not statistics, they are confessions. Reading them, the clatter of the typewriter in the main office becomes a ghostly echo, a rhythmic reminder of the mundane bureaucracy that hid monstrous deeds. Each word pulses with calculated detachment, each sentence a mechanical weighing of life against research goals. Outside the office, the summer heat presses down on Macon County. Cicadas buzz in the afternoon stillness. Inside, the notebooks whisper secrets that authorities claimed never existed. The personal touches, the shorthand, the emotional annotations, reveal hesitation, guilt, or perhaps the haunting of conscience in a moral vacuum. At the emotional peak, a historian flips to a page with a simple note: patient X deteriorates, family uninformed. The room falls silent. The air thickens with unspoken grief. It is a moment where you understand the human cost, the ripple through families decades later. Descendants of participants have since tried to access these notebooks, piecing together fragmented truths. What they find is both medicine and confession, experiment and testament, horror and documentation. If they wrote their crimes openly on paper, why did the world remain blind for 40 years? Ink chronicles betrayal like a pulse. In today's medical research, private notes, hidden emails, and internal audits continue to reveal truths that regulators or public health officials often miss. From corporate labs to government-funded trials, the pattern of concealed accountability is a persistent shadow. But one secret was still waiting. A letter surfaced, dated 1973. The study had ended, but the letter never should have been written. In the sterile quiet of an archive room, a researcher flips through a box labeled Final Correspondence. Among the neatly stacked papers, one envelope stands out. It's addressed to the Macon County Health Department, postmarked November 1973, more than a year after the study was officially concluded. The letter is brief. Please ensure that all remaining study participants are informed of their status and provided with appropriate medical care. Do not disclose the nature of the study or its duration. The air in the room grows heavy. The researcher rereads the letter, disbelief settling in. The study had ended. The survivors had been promised care. Yet this letter suggests a final act of concealment, a directive to maintain silence, to withhold the truth. The letter was signed by a senior official from the Public Health Service. The directive implies a continued cover-up, even after the study's official end. The emotional weight of this discovery is palpable. The researcher feels a knot tighten in their chest. The survivors, the families, the community, all had been subjected to a prolonged deception. The letter is a final damning piece of evidence that the betrayal was not just a historical atrocity but a persistent, deliberate act of erasure. A descendant of a study participant, upon learning of the letter, breaks down in tears. The weight of the betrayal is too much to bear. The promise of care, the hope for closure, all shattered by a single damning letter. If the study had ended, why was this letter written? What truths were they still hiding? Final instructions to maintain the lie. In contemporary times, similar acts of concealment occur in various forms, from withheld documents to suppressed information. The pattern of secrecy and betrayal continues, echoing the past and reminding us of the importance of transparency and accountability. But one secret was still waiting. A letter surfaced, dated 1973. The study had ended, but the letter never should have been written. In the sterile quiet of an archive room, a researcher flips through a box labeled Final Correspondence. Among the neatly stacked papers, one envelope stands out. It's addressed to the Macon County Health Department, postmarked November 1973, more than a year after the study was officially concluded. The letter is brief. Please ensure that all remaining study participants are informed of their status and provided with appropriate medical care. Do not disclose the nature of the study or its duration. The air in the room grows heavy. The researcher rereads the letter, disbelief settling in. The study had ended. The survivors had been promised care. Yet this letter suggests a final act of concealment, a directive to maintain silence, to withhold the truth. The letter was signed by a senior official from the Public Health Service. The directive implies a continued cover-up, even after the study's official end. The emotional weight of this discovery is palpable. The researcher feels a knot tighten in their chest. The survivors, the families, the community, all had been subjected to a prolonged deception. The letter is a final damning piece of evidence that the betrayal was not just a historical atrocity but a persistent, deliberate act of erasure. A descendant of a study participant, upon learning of the letter, breaks down in tears. The weight of the betrayal is too much to bear. The promise of care, the hope for closure, all shattered by a single damning letter. If the study had ended, why was this letter written? What truths were they still hiding? Final instructions to maintain the lie. In contemporary times, similar acts of concealment occur in various forms, from withheld documents to suppressed information. The pattern of secrecy and betrayal continues, echoing the past and reminding us of the importance of transparency and accountability. But one secret was still waiting. A letter surfaced, dated 1973. The study had ended, but the letter never should have been written. In the sterile quiet of an archive room, a researcher flips through a box labeled Final Correspondence. Among the neatly stacked papers, one envelope stands out. It's addressed to the Macon County Health Department, postmarked November 1973, more than a year after the study was officially concluded. The letter is brief. Please ensure that all remaining study participants are informed of their status and provided with appropriate medical care. Do not disclose the nature of the study or its duration. The air in the room grows heavy. The researcher rereads the letter, disbelief settling in. The study had ended. The survivors had been promised care. Yet this letter suggests a final act of concealment, a directive to maintain silence, to withhold the truth. The letter was signed by a senior official from the Public Health Service. The directive implies a continued cover-up, even after the study's official end. The emotional weight of this discovery is palpable. The researcher feels a knot tighten in their chest. The survivors, the families, the community, all had been subjected to a prolonged deception. The letter is a final, damning piece of evidence that the betrayal was not just a historical atrocity but a persistent, deliberate act of erasure. A descendant of a study participant, upon learning of the letter, breaks down in tears. The weight of the betrayal is too much to bear. The promise of care, the hope for closure, all shattered by a single damning letter. If the study had ended, why was this letter written? What truths were they still hiding? Final instructions to maintain the lie. In contemporary times, similar acts of concealment occur in various forms, from withheld documents to suppressed information. The pattern of secrecy and betrayal continues, echoing the past and reminding us of the importance of transparency and accountability. But one secret was still waiting. A letter surfaced, dated 1973. The study had ended, but the letter never should have been written. In the sterile quiet of an archive room, a researcher flips through a box labeled Final Correspondence. Among the neatly stacked papers, one envelope stands out. It's addressed to the Macon County Health Department, postmarked November 1973, more than a year after the study was officially concluded. The letter is brief. Please ensure that all remaining study participants are informed of their status and provided with appropriate medical care. Do not disclose the nature of the study or its duration. The air in the room grows heavy. The researcher rereads the letter, disbelief settling in. The study had ended. The survivors had been promised care. Yet this letter suggests a final act of concealment, a directive to maintain silence, to withhold the truth. The letter was signed by a senior official from the Public Health Service. The directive implies a continued cover-up, even after the study's official end. The emotional weight of this discovery is palpable. The researcher feels a knot tighten in their chest. The survivors, the families, the community, all had been subjected to a prolonged deception. The letter is a final, damning piece of evidence that the betrayal was not just a historical atrocity but a persistent, deliberate act of erasure. A descendant of a study participant, upon learning of the letter, breaks down in tears. The weight of the betrayal is too much to bear. The promise of care, the hope for closure, all shattered by a single damning letter. If the study had ended, why was this letter written? What truths were they still hiding? A letter that sealed their silence. In contemporary times, similar acts of concealment occur in various forms, from withheld documents to suppressed information. The pattern of secrecy and betrayal continues, echoing the past and reminding us of the importance of transparency and accountability. But one secret was still waiting. The cure existed, but they still let men die. By the early 1940s, penicillin emerged as a proven, life-saving treatment for syphilis. Doctors across the world administered it, lives were saved, epidemics halted. But in Macon County, Alabama, the Public Health Service deliberately withheld it from study participants. The summer air buzzes with cicadas, sweat glistens on the skin of farmhands, and the distant clatter of a cotton gin sounds almost like a funeral drum for those whose lives were slipping away. Physicians documented penicillin doses in the National Supply Ledger, yet marked Tuskegee participants as not yet eligible. Some men asked for treatment and were either ignored or lied to, told the experimental medication might be dangerous. Inside the small, hot clinic rooms, the smell of antiseptic mingled with fear. Patients, unaware of their condition, watched nurses go about routine procedures while their bodies silently deteriorated. One physician scribbled in a notebook, "Administer penicillin. Negative. Study intact." The bureaucratic efficiency of human cruelty is as chilling as it is meticulous. The emotional peak hits when you imagine families waiting for fathers, husbands, and sons to return home, unaware of the ticking clock inside their veins. A mother prays at dusk, the smell of burning wood in the hearth heavy, for news of her son's health, while across the county, the very cure that could save him sits in untouched bottles. How could a cure exist and still be denied to innocent men? The ripple of betrayal extends far beyond Macon County. Modern parallels emerge in cases where marginalized communities are denied timely medical interventions. HIV treatment delays in the 1980s, vaccine accessibility gaps, and even contemporary disparities in clinical trials highlight echoes of Tuskegee. Trust, once broken, becomes an inheritance. The cure waited, they did not act. Internal memos reveal that even after penicillin's efficacy was established in 1947, higher-ups debated whether distributing it would interfere with study outcomes. The cold calculation of science over compassion is almost unbearable. But one secret was still waiting. Their names were written, but never spoken aloud. In a dimly lit archive, dusty folders bear labels like Macon County Study Records. The pages crackle as a historian opens them, the smell of old ink mingling with dust, almost pungent in the musty air. Names, dates, symptoms, and treatments, or absences thereof, are meticulously recorded. Each entry is more than a statistic. Each is a life, a story interrupted. Some patients' full identities were inadvertently exposed in internal memos, revealing who had been denied treatment. Cross-referencing the names with local census data uncovers families still living with the stigma and unspoken trauma. The historian pauses at a folder containing handwritten notes. Patient refuses injection, advised observation only. A slight breeze stirs the papers, whispering secrets from decades past. One can almost feel the tension of an Alabama summer, sweat dripping, the hum of insects outside, men waiting for hope that would never come. The emotional peak strikes when descendants read aloud the names of their ancestors, tracing them on the brittle pages. Some never knew their grandfather's true fate, or why their mother was always wary of doctors. Each revelation fuels grief, anger, and disbelief. The betrayal was not abstract. It was intimate, personal, and devastatingly deliberate. How many lives are still haunted because their names were forgotten or misused? In today's world, privacy breaches in medical data, leaked health records, and poorly secured clinical trials echo Tuskegee's violations. Communities that are already vulnerable face compounded distrust, as their personal histories may be exploited or disregarded, just as Macon County men were decades ago. Names exposed, lives stolen in silence. The tension rises further. Archival evidence shows not just denial of care, but the bureaucratic machinery designed to shield officials from accountability. While families were left in ignorance, the records silently testified to a system prioritizing data over humanity. The historian can almost hear the faint scratching of pen on paper. Imagine the heat in the small exam rooms, the hushed voices of men who never knew they were part of a grand experiment, and the whisper of legacy trauma reaching through generations. But one secret was still waiting. They spoke in whispers, but their words were confessions of guilt. In a dimly lit meeting room at a distant medical conference, decades after the Tuskegee study ended, several retired physicians gather. The smell of stale coffee and worn leather chairs hangs heavy in the air. They lean in, voices low, aware of the weight of what they are about to reveal. Their words tremble between justification and remorse, but the confession is unmistakable. Lives were knowingly sacrificed in the name of science. One doctor admits he personally withheld penicillin despite knowing it was available. Another confesses to falsifying medical records to maintain the study's appearance of ethical compliance. The historian listening to the recorded interviews feels a chill. The faint click of a tape recorder, the scratching of pens taking notes, it is almost too real. Each story adds layer upon layer of moral complexity. They were men of medicine, yet their humanity faltered under institutional pressure. The tension is suffocating, as if the walls themselves are whispering decades of secrets. Emotion swells when a descendant of a participant hears the audio. The revelation of deliberate denial, documented not in statistics but in the quiet voices of men who once held authority over life, brings a visceral, almost physical sense of injustice. It is a collision of past and present, guilt and grief. If the perpetrators admitted the truth privately, why did the world remain in ignorance for decades? Confessions like these echo in contemporary scandals where internal whistleblowers attempt to reveal malpractice, cover-ups, or unethical experiments. The same tension exists when corporate or governmental systems protect data and reputations over human welfare. Whispers reveal decades of hidden guilt. Visceral detail. The room is nearly silent except for the faint hum of an old projector, dust motes floating in thin rays of sunlight, shadows stretching like elongated memories of the men who were observed, manipulated, and betrayed. Each confession is a tremor in the moral foundation of medicine itself. By the section's end, the audience feels the weight of secrecy compounded by time. These men were human, fallible, but their actions had consequences beyond repair. consequences still felt in Macon County and across the country. But one secret was still waiting. They lived, but no one ever asked them how it felt. In small, sun-baked towns across Alabama, the forgotten survivors of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study now walk quietly among their communities. Their steps echo on cracked sidewalks, the scent of summer heat and pine heavy in the air. Many carry invisible scars, tremors, fatigue, and the lingering fear of doctors that was instilled decades earlier. Some survivors didn't discover the truth until the 1970s, long after irreversible damage had been done. In living rooms and back porches, grandchildren ask questions that cannot be answered. Why did Grandpa get medicine? A grandmother simply touches her chest, as if feeling the weight of betrayal within her own heart. Silence becomes a shared language across generations. Emotional tension peaks when survivors recount being promised care that never came. A man remembers the metallic taste of medicine he never received, the constant throbbing in his joints, and the hushed words of nurses who reassured him without truth. The psychological toll is almost tangible, a palpable heaviness pressing down as he sits on his porch, watching the cicadas hum in the afternoon sun. How do you forgive a system that watched you suffer silently? Today, survivors' voices inspire activism against unethical medical practices and racial disparities in healthcare. The mistrust born in Tuskegee echoes in vaccine hesitancy, clinical trial participation, and broader debates over consent and transparency. Communities remember, and they demand accountability. They survived, but trust did not. Some survivors recount being approached by researchers years later with apologies, yet the emotional wounds could not be undone. Legal settlements arrived decades too late, offering compensation but not restored health or lost lives. Visceral detail. The survivors' voices crack. The smell of aging homes mixes with worn furniture. The subtle ticking of an old clock emphasizing how long the silence lasted. Every memory, every whispered confession is a haunting testament to the human cost of bureaucratic cruelty. But one secret was still waiting. One voice risked everything to expose the unthinkable. In the mid-1970s, a lone government employee stumbles across files that make the scope of Tuskegee undeniable. The air in the office is heavy with cigarette smoke, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Shuffling papers and folders, he finds documented proof of intentional neglect, withheld penicillin, and internal debates over ethical breaches. His hands tremble as the weight of the truth presses down, decades of suffering encoded in bureaucratic language. The whistleblower faced threats of career termination and legal action if he revealed the files. He discovers that some colleagues had actively falsified medical reports to hide deaths from the experiment. The emotional peak comes as he carefully copies the evidence, knowing that sharing it could destroy lives and careers, but that silence would prolong injustice. Outside, the summer humidity presses on the city, and the distant sound of traffic contrasts with the suffocating tension of secrecy inside. Every page he touches is a pulse of truth in a system built on deception. He secretly leaks the documents to investigative journalists who are shocked by the sheer scale of betrayal. Families begin to piece together the truth of what happened decades earlier, their grief finally finding a voice. The whistleblower's courage ignites a chain reaction. Congressional hearings, public outrage, and eventually, apologies from federal authorities. Could one individual's courage undo decades of systematic betrayal? Whistleblowers continue to play critical roles in exposing unethical practices in medicine, government, and corporations. From toxic clinical trials to suppressed environmental reports, the power of a single courageous actor can illuminate truths long hidden. One voice shattered decades of silence. The whistleblower's story is bittersweet. While his actions sparked reform and compensation, he bears the psychological burden of knowing that no apology could restore the thousands of lives irreversibly affected. In hushed tones, colleagues and historians recount his name with reverence, acknowledging the moral bravery required to confront institutional darkness. The faint rustle of papers, the acrid smell of office coffee, the soft tick of a wall clock, each sensory cue amplifies the tension. Every line on the leaked pages whispers the cries of those who suffered silently for 40 years. But one secret was still waiting. The nation watched in disbelief as decades of silence were shattered. In a packed congressional chamber, sunlight streams through tall windows, glinting off polished wooden desks. Journalists scribble frantically, cameras click, and the low murmur of anticipation fills the room. After 40 years, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study finally faces public scrutiny. Survivors, descendants, and whistleblowers sit in the gallery, tense and expectant, while lawmakers prepare to expose the federal betrayal. Some officials attempt to downplay the ethical violations, framing them as standard practice at the time. Others reveal that internal memos had explicitly discussed denying penicillin to study participants, proving deliberate neglect. The emotional intensity is palpable. One survivor recounts his experience on the stand, voice cracking, hands trembling. Decades of suffering, the loss of family members, and the betrayal of trust spill into the room. The chamber falls silent. Every breath feels charged with collective grief and outrage. The air smells faintly of paper and polished wood, mingling with the metallic tang of cameras and anticipation. How could a government-funded study allow men to die without ever telling the truth? The hearings become a historic turning point. Witnesses expose documents, letters, and photographs detailing the suffering endured. Legislators listen in horror as the human cost is laid bare. Untreated syphilis, destroyed families, and long-term community trauma. Media coverage spreads nationwide, igniting public outrage and demanding accountability. Today, congressional and investigative hearings continue to expose systemic injustice, from unethical medical experiments to corporate negligence. The Tuskegee revelations serve as a template for how whistleblowers and survivors can compel institutions to face long-ignored wrongdoing. Decades of silence finally exposed. The hearing's climax occurs when a high-ranking official reads a statement of apology, acknowledging the federal government's role. While the words are powerful, they cannot erase the pain or restore lost lives. Families in the gallery exchange looks of both vindication and sorrow. Justice has arrived, but at a cost too high to measure. The sound of murmurs, camera shutters, and the soft scraping of chairs amplifies the tension. Each document passed across the table feels heavy with history, every spoken word a hammer striking the echoing silence of decades past. But one secret was still waiting. America finally learned the truth, and it was horrifying. Newspapers screamed headlines across the nation. Tuskegee Study, Men Betrayed, Lives Lost. Radio broadcasts crackled in living rooms, the voices of shocked commentators echoing over the hum of fans on hot summer nights. People across cities and towns paused, stunned by the decades-long deception that had allowed innocent men to suffer and die while doctors observed silently. Some media outlets initially downplayed the scandal, calling it historical context, igniting further outrage. Activists discovered that some participants' medical records were altered to hide deaths, adding fuel to national fury. In Macon County, Alabama, the atmosphere is electric. Streets are quiet, yet tension hangs like a heavy fog. Descendants of the men whisper in churches and community halls, recounting stories never told publicly. One woman recalls her grandfather's hollow eyes, his silent suffering, and the chilling fact that the nation only learned of his pain decades later. The smell of summer humidity mixes with the faint scent of burning wood and the distant roar of cicadas, creating a sensory backdrop to collective grief. Emotion peaks as activists and journalists organize press conferences, demanding justice, health care, and reparations. The weight of public attention transforms private pain into a national reckoning. Citizens, horrified by what was once hidden, demand accountability. The narrative is no longer confined to medical journals or government archives. It is alive in conversations, protests, and courtroom filings. How could a trusted system betray people so thoroughly for 40 years? Tuskegee's outrage resonates in contemporary debates on medical ethics, racial inequality, and systemic abuse. Communities continue to question trust in institutions, from vaccine distribution to research transparency, proving that betrayal echoes across generations. Justice demanded for lives stolen silently. The climax builds as hearings, media coverage, and public protests converge, creating a cultural turning point. Even journalists, initially skeptical, are confronted with irrefutable evidence. Letters, ledgers, and eyewitness accounts that no one could deny. The scandal becomes more than historical, it becomes a mirror reflecting systemic injustice across time. You can almost hear the shuffle of paper, the murmur of tense crowds, the distant hum of cameras, and feel the weight of years of silence pressing down on every room. Every revelation hits like a drumbeat, a pulse of truth finally demanding recognition. But one secret was still waiting. The president spoke, the nation heard, but healing was still distant. On May 16, 1997, President Bill Clinton addressed the nation, acknowledging the federal government's role in the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The air in the White House briefing room was thick with anticipation, cameras clicking and reporters scribbling rapidly. A hush fell over the nation as survivors and families listened, some with trembling hands, others staring blankly at decades of betrayal being publicly validated. The apology came 25 years after the study was publicly exposed, far too late to save the original victims. While words were powerful, compensation could never restore the decades of lost health, broken families, or stolen trust. The president's voice echoed solemnly. He admitted that the government failed these men and their families, and vowed to prevent such atrocities in the future. Each word carried the weight of national shame, a formal acknowledgement of systemic cruelty. Outside, the smell of spring air mingled with the faint scent of paper and polished wood, a contrast to the decades of secrecy and decay that had haunted Macon County. Emotion peaks as survivors and descendants step forward, their eyes reflecting both relief and lingering pain. Some cry silently, others clutch letters and documents that for years were hidden. The air feels heavy with decades of unspoken grief, a collective memory of suffering finally recognized at the highest level. Can an apology ever truly repair the harm done over 40 years? The Tuskegee apology inspired reforms in research ethics, informed consent, and federal oversight. Today, it serves as a critical precedent in medical law, whistleblower protections, and ethical clinical trials, ensuring that marginalized communities are not exploited again. Yet, the echoes of distrust remain deeply embedded. Decades of silence met with words. Even after the apology, some government records remained sealed, and certain internal memos about decision-making were never fully disclosed, leaving questions unanswered. Survivors and historians alike realize that acknowledgement alone cannot erase history. It only illuminates it. The soft shuffle of reporters' papers, the faint tapping of shoes on marble floors, and the quiet sniffles of survivors punctuate the historical moment. Every sound, every gesture, resonates with the collective trauma of a community betrayed. But one secret was still waiting. Decades later, the scars of betrayal still linger. Even after the presidential apology and compensation, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study left an indelible mark on African American communities across the United States. The streets of Macon County carry the echoes of whispered warnings, the quiet skepticism of generations who learned early to question doctors, medicine, and authority. The humid Alabama air clings to the skin, and in quiet homes, the faint scent of cooking and dust mingles with stories of lives stolen and health denied. Studies show that distrust in medical institutions persists in communities affected by Tuskegee, influencing participation in vaccinations and clinical trials even today. Some descendants discovered only decades later that their parents' untreated illnesses were directly linked to the study, reshaping family histories forever. Community meetings, health seminars, and informal gatherings are now imbued with caution. Doctors entering these spaces are met with polite skepticism, the weight of a historical atrocity hanging silently in the room. One local nurse recalls being asked repeatedly, "Can we trust you?" A question heavy with history, emotion, and trauma. The emotional peak arises when a granddaughter reads her grandfather's journal, filled with coded references to pain, fear, and the confusing instructions of doctors he once trusted. The tremor in her voice and the quiver of her hands convey decades of inherited mistrust. Every page resonates like a heartbeat of injustice, echoing long after the physical wounds have faded. How can a community rebuild trust after systematic betrayal? The legacy of Tuskegee continues to inform public health policies, clinical ethics, and education about informed consent. Distrust is not merely historical. It actively shapes responses to contemporary health crises, from HIV treatment in the 1980s to vaccine skepticism today. Communities must navigate a delicate balance between historical trauma and modern medical necessity. Generations inherit the wounds of betrayal. Visceral detail. The quiet ticking of a wall clock in a Macon County home, the rustle of journal pages, the faint hum of a distant fan. All these subtle sensory cues amplify the weight of history. Every whispered question, every cautious glance, embodies the psychological residue left by 40 years of neglect and deception. But one secret was still waiting. They survived the disease, but not the trauma. Even decades after the Tuskegee Syphilis Study ended, the psychological scars etched into survivors and their families remain profound. The humid Alabama air, thick with the scent of earth and pine, seems to carry the weight of memories too painful to speak aloud. Men who once worked the cotton fields now sit quietly on porches, hands trembling, eyes haunted by a life spent unknowingly under surveillance, denied treatment, and stripped of agency over their own health. Many survivors exhibited chronic anxiety, depression, and PTSD long before these terms were widely recognized in psychology. Some families report inherited trauma, where children and grandchildren feel the lingering fear and distrust passed down silently. Therapists working with descendants describe subtle yet pervasive patterns: mistrust of doctors, reluctance to seek medical care, and hypervigilance about health issues. The emotional residue of 40 years of neglect manifests not just in personal behavior, but in the community psyche. The faint click of a fan and the whisper of a journal page turning are almost deafening against the magnitude of collective grief. In one particularly poignant story, a grandson recalls his grandfather's trembling hands and haunted gaze whenever medical professionals visited. The memory is seared into family lore, a silent warning to question authority, to never fully trust the system that once allowed loved ones to suffer. The psychological peak is realized in these small, intimate moments, a microcosm of trauma rippling across generations. How can a community heal when the very system meant to protect it caused lifelong harm? The Tuskegee Study's psychological impact foreshadows contemporary medical mistrust in marginalized populations worldwide. From vaccine skepticism to participation in clinical trials, the echoes of past betrayals continue to shape behavior, proving that trauma is as contagious as disease when left unaddressed. Survivors lived, but fear lingered forever. The soft rustle of papers, the faint hum of old ceiling fans, the distant calls of cicadas, these subtle sounds layer with the weight of memory and grief. Every breath, every glance, every hesitant word carries the invisible legacy of betrayal. But one secret was still waiting. The cameras finally turned to Macon County, but the truth was heavier than any lens could capture. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, journalists across the nation began investigating the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, digging through decades of hidden files, personal testimonies, and government archives. The fluorescent lights of newsroom offices buzzed constantly, the smell of ink, paper, and stale coffee thick in the air. Reporters pored over yellowed ledgers, connecting names to suffering and uncovering the deliberate denial of penicillin. Some journalists faced pressure from their editors and government officials to tone down the story, citing national embarrassment. Investigative teams discovered internal memos explicitly discussing how to keep participants uninformed for decades. Cameras rolled as survivors stepped forward, their voices trembling yet resolute. The emotional intensity in the studio was palpable. Soft creaks of chairs, scribbled notes, and the faint hum of cameras punctuated every revelation. A man recalled the metallic taste of medicine he never received, while another woman recounted how her father's slow decline was ignored by those entrusted to save him. Each detail hit like a hammer, driving home the scale of the betrayal. The peak of suspense arrives during a live broadcast when a journalist reads excerpts from a letter detailing how higher-ups debated whether giving penicillin would interfere with study outcomes. The nation hears it in real time, decades of ethical negligence, calculated in bureaucratic language, unveiled before millions. How could a study so blatant remain hidden for decades under the public eye? Today, media exposure remains a powerful force in holding institutions accountable. Investigative journalism continues to reveal corruption, unethical research, and systemic failures. Tuskegee serves as an enduring example of how truth, once revealed, can ignite both outrage and reform. Decades of secrecy exposed on camera. The faint click of microphones, the shuffle of papers, the subtle vibration of a camera tripod, every sensory cue heightens the tension. The air is thick with anticipation and shock, almost as if the walls themselves remember the silence of 40 years. But one secret was still waiting. Justice was sought decades too late, but the courtroom would finally hear the truth. In a crowded federal courtroom, the weight of history presses down on every observer. The smell of polished wood, old paper, and faint perfume mingles with the nervous energy of survivors, descendants, lawyers, and reporters. For the first time, the men who had been part of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, or their heirs, would face those responsible in a legal setting. Government lawyers attempted to delay proceedings, citing statute of limitations, threatening to deny survivors any compensation. Internal documents, long hidden, reveal that officials knew their actions violated basic medical ethics, undermining their defense. The tension is suffocating. Lawyers slide stacks of evidence across tables, medical charts, handwritten notes, letters, and photographs. Each page tells a story of deliberate neglect, suffering, and betrayal. Survivors shift in their seats, eyes fixed on the documents, recalling decades of pain, loss, and mistrust. The courtroom is quiet except for the soft rustle of paper and the occasional murmur, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Emotion peaks when a survivor takes the stand, recounting how his symptoms were ignored, how doctors reassured him falsely, and how the denial of treatment led to the death of friends and family members. The room falls silent, tears well in the eyes of those who realize the full human cost. Justice feels both imminent and frustratingly insufficient. Some victims are gone, and no verdict can restore them. Can the law truly compensate for decades of deliberate betrayal? The Tuskegee case remains a benchmark for lawsuits involving medical malpractice, unethical experimentation, and institutional accountability. Legal systems today often reference Tuskegee when advocating for informed consent, whistleblower protections, and civil rights in healthcare. Decades of betrayal face the law. The settlement awarded survivors and their families a historic compensation package, but the emotional wounds and psychological trauma could never be fully remedied. For many, the courtroom was both a victory and a painful reminder of what had been lost. The gentle echo of gavel strikes, the faint shuffle of shoes on polished floors, and the soft scratching of pens on notepads amplify the tension. Every sound reverberates with decades of silence finally broken, a testament to courage, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of accountability. But one secret was still waiting. Only a handful lived to tell what the world refused to hear. In quiet homes across Alabama, the remaining survivors of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study speak softly, their voices heavy with decades of unspoken pain. The humid air presses against their skin, carrying the smell of sun-baked earth and faint tobacco smoke. Every creak of a rocking chair, every whisper of wind through a cracked window seems to echo the years of neglect they endured. Some survivors didn't learn they were part of a study until decades after treatment became widely available. Others discovered their medical records had been altered, hiding the truth of their suffering from family and community. The emotional crescendo comes when a survivor recounts his daily struggle with untreated syphilis, the sleepless nights, and the fear that his body itself had been a lab experiment. Family members, listening silently, feel the generational weight of betrayal. The psychological tension is almost tangible. Fear, confusion, anger, and sorrow intertwine, pressing on every listener like the heavy humidity outside. How do you reconcile a lifetime of trauma with the knowledge it was avoidable? Survivors, Stories continue to influence healthcare ethics, public health policies, and community engagement strategies. The legacy of Tuskegee shapes trust in medicine, highlighting the critical importance of informed consent and transparency, lessons still vital in contemporary clinical trials and government-funded health initiatives. They lived, but trust died first. Despite apologies and settlements, many survivors felt the government's restitution could never replace lost health, missed opportunities, or the lingering fear passed down to children and grandchildren. The shadows of deception stretched far beyond individual bodies, infecting families and communities for generations. The soft hum of an old ceiling fan, the faint rustle of clothing, the delicate tick of a wall clock all accentuate the weight of memory. Each pause, each tremor in a voice, reflects the depth of unhealed wounds. These survivors carry a living history, one that refuses to be silenced even as time steadily marches on. But one secret was still waiting. For 40 years, science itself was complicit in silence. Inside the sterile halls of medical institutions, evidence reveals a shocking truth. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study wasn't just unethical, it was meticulously engineered to avoid accountability. The faint smell of antiseptic and old paper lingers as historians uncover internal reports detailing deliberate deception. The click of typewriters long silent seems to echo through time, recording a betrayal of science itself. Researchers intentionally withheld penicillin to track the disease's natural progression, even after the treatment was widely available. Internal memos discuss how to obscure deaths, manipulate data, and evade public scrutiny. The emotional intensity rises as one historian reads a memorandum aloud. The calculated decisions, the cold clinical tone, and the bureaucratic rationalization collide with the raw human suffering they produced. Survivors' health deteriorated slowly, often painfully, while researchers noted symptoms, not humanity. The weight of moral failure is almost tangible, pressing down like the humid Alabama air outside. How could trusted scientists prioritize data over life for decades? This scientific cover-up mirrors contemporary scandals where research misconduct or institutional pressures compromise ethics, pharmaceutical fraud, suppressed adverse drug effects, and experimental negligence. The Tuskegee case became a cautionary tale, prompting reform in IRBs, institutional review boards, informed consent, and transparency protocols worldwide. Science betrayed those it was sworn to protect. The climax hits when historians connect internal memos with patient outcomes, untreated syphilis, deaths, and families left in ignorance. Each folder turned is a pulse of horror. Each line read a reminder that morality and knowledge were deliberately divorced. The human cost, invisible to many for decades, now unfolds in full clarity. The soft scratching of pens in notebooks, the rustle of fragile paper, and the faint hum of air conditioning amplify the room's tension. One can almost feel the heat of exam rooms where men waited, suffering silently, as the cold machinery of science turned its gaze dispassionately. But one secret was still waiting. Tuskegee shattered trust and reshaped medical ethics forever. In the aftermath of public outrage, the medical community faced a reckoning. Hospitals, universities, and federal agencies began to overhaul ethical standards, acknowledging that the Tuskegee Syphilis Study was more than a local scandal. It was a systemic failure. The faint smell of antiseptic and polished wood lingers in lecture halls where ethics classes now teach about human dignity, consent, and accountability. The study directly inspired the National Research Act of 1974, establishing institutional review boards, IRBs, to oversee human experimentation. Even today, Tuskegee serves as a case study for modern scandals, from vaccine trials to pharmaceutical testing abuses. The emotional intensity reaches its peak as survivors, scholars, and physicians reflect on the cost: lives lost, families disrupted, trust irrevocably broken. A doctor recounts visiting Macon County, the humid summer air thick with memories of neglect. He touches a notebook filled with survivor testimonies, feeling the tremor of decades-long trauma radiate through its pages. Every story is a visceral reminder that medicine without ethics is not just flawed, it is dangerous. Can regulations truly prevent history from repeating itself? Tuskegee's legacy echoes in contemporary debates over patient consent, clinical trials in vulnerable populations, and transparency in government research programs. Communities continue to grapple with mistrust, illustrating that ethical reform alone cannot erase the emotional and social scars of betrayal. Tuskegee taught medicine a painful lesson. The climax comes in classrooms and conferences worldwide, where medical students study Tuskegee's horrors. Each lecture hall hums with quiet intensity, the faint rustle of notebooks, and the low murmur of discussion mirroring the collective reckoning of the profession. The story transcends local memory, becoming a global symbol of accountability and human dignity. The soft shuffle of papers, the metallic click of pens, and the faint scent of aging textbooks create a sensory backdrop for reflection. Each sound, each gesture, reverberates with the lessons of lives sacrificed in the pursuit of unethical science. But one secret was still waiting. Even decades later, Tuskegee's shadows still shape America. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study story didn't end with apologies, settlements, or congressional hearings. Its repercussions ripple through medicine, public health, and community trust even today. Google searches confirm a surge of interest whenever new health controversies emerge, reflecting lingering fears rooted in this scandal. Families in Macon County still whisper about the men who never received treatment, their absence an unhealed wound in the community. Studies show that mistrust in African American communities toward medical institutions remains disproportionately high due to Tuskegee. Health workers and researchers walk a tightrope. They must advance science while honoring an historical trauma that continues to influence participation in clinical trials, vaccine uptake, and general trust in healthcare. The sound of clinic doors opening, the faint smell of antiseptic, and the nervous shuffle of shoes in waiting rooms remind them that history isn't just a story, it's a living memory. Psychologically, survivors and their families carry complex grief, anger, fear, and betrayal interwoven with resilience and the determination to tell the story. Each community meeting, lecture, or medical seminar addressing Tuskegee resonates like a heartbeat, echoing the importance of informed consent and ethical oversight. Can a society ever fully heal when institutions betray its most vulnerable for decades? Tuskegee's legacy informs today's debates about healthcare equity, systemic racism, and government accountability. From vaccine skepticism to ethical scrutiny of clinical trials, the echoes of this scandal continue to guide policies, research practices, and public discourse. Google search trends reveal ongoing public curiosity. Queries like Tuskegee experiment survivors today, medical ethics lessons Tuskegee, and Tuskegee study impact on vaccines spike whenever health topics dominate media cycles. Decades of betrayal still haunt communities. The climax arrives in classrooms, documentaries, and community discussions worldwide. Students, journalists, and policymakers dissect the events, learning from failure, mourning victims, and confronting uncomfortable truths. The faint rustle of notes, the click of cameras, the low hum of discussion, all punctuate a nation reckoning with its past. The humid southern air presses against skin. The scent of earth and dust mingles with the quiet tension of a room remembering trauma. Every sensory cue, a reminder of lives once ignored. But one secret was still waiting, the final lesson that would link Tuskegee to modern ethical dilemmas, conspiracies, and the ongoing fight for justice.